The train lurched to a stop at the Cutters Creek Depot on a blazing July afternoon in 1878, and Adelaide Dalton stepped onto the platform with a carpetbag in one hand, a 3-month-old baby boy pressed against her chest in the other, and absolutely nothing waiting for her on the other side of that door except the wide, unforgiving dust of the Texas Panhandle. She had rehearsed what she would say 100 times on that rattling, smoke-choked train ride from Kansas City, had practiced the calm expression she would wear when people looked at her left hand and found it bare, had told herself that she would carry her chin high and her spine straight, and she would not, under any circumstances, cry in public. She had managed all of that for the first 47 hours of the journey. But standing there on that warped wooden platform, squinting into the relentless white sun with baby Thomas beginning to fuss against her shoulder, Adelaide felt the careful architecture of her composure begin to crack right down the middle. The depot at Cutters Creek was little more than a tin-roofed shack with a hand-painted sign and a row of barrels that served as seating for men who looked like they had been sitting there since before the war and had no intention of moving afterward. 2 of those men glanced up at her, their eyes doing the slow arithmetic that strangers' eyes always did, moving from her face to her ringless left hand to the baby, and then to the absence of any man walking behind her off that train. She watched them reach their conclusion and turn back to one another, and she felt the familiar heat of shame begin to climb her throat. She would not let it win. She had decided that in Kansas City, the night she packed every last thing she owned into one carpetbag and left the boarding house where she had been paying rent with the last of the money her mother had sent before she died. She had made her choice. She was going west, to the small inheritance her mother had left her in the form of 20 acres of scrubland outside a town called Cutters Creek, land that a solicitor in Kansas City had written her about in a letter that smelled of dust and possibility. It was hers. It was the only thing in the world that was hers, and she was going to stand on it and build something, even if she had to do it alone. But the platform was longer and lonelier than she had imagined, and the depot agent inside the shack had gone somewhere, and the men on the barrels were pretending she did not exist, and Thomas had escalated from fussing to outright crying, and Adelaide's arm was aching from the weight of the carpetbag, and the sun was so brutally, personally hot that she felt it as an insult. She was trying to shift the baby to her other arm and set down the carpetbag long enough to fish the solicitor's letter out of her coat pocket when she heard boots on the platform boards. Slow, unhurried boots, the kind that belonged to someone who had nowhere urgent to be and was completely comfortable with that fact. "You need some help with that." The voice belonged to a man who looked like he had been assembled by the land itself. He was tall in the way that the Texas sky was tall, not aggressively, just as a matter of fact. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the edges where his hat brim ended, a jaw that was all clean angles and sun-browned skin, and eyes the color of creek water in the shade, somewhere between gray and green depending on how the light hit them. He was wearing a worn canvas duster that had probably been the color of sand when it was new, and had since become the color of everything, and he held his hat in one hand because apparently the heat did not trouble him the way it troubled the rest of the world. He was looking at her with an expression that was not the calculating arithmetic of the men on the barrels. He was looking at her the way a person looked at someone who was clearly in a difficult situation and deserved a hand, no more complicated than that, and Adelaide felt something in her chest loosen just slightly. "I'm managing," she said, because she had told herself she would. "You don't look like you're managing," he said, and there was no unkindness in it. "You look like you're about 30 seconds from dropping either the bag or the baby, and I'd recommend dropping the bag." Despite everything, despite the heat and the aching arm and the crying child and the men on the barrels and the whole tremendous weight of the life she had left behind and the unknown life ahead of her, a small and involuntary sound escaped Adelaide's throat. It was almost a laugh. "The bag has everything I own in it," she said. "Then we're definitely keeping the baby," he said, and he bent and picked up her carpetbag as though it were a gesture so obvious it required no discussion. "Where are you headed?" "I have a letter," she said, shifting Thomas against her shoulder and patting his back in the firm, rhythmic way she had learned worked best. "From a solicitor. I have land outside town, 20 acres. I just need to find someone who can tell me how to get there." He took the letter she held out to him, read it with the careful attention of a man who read slowly and meant every word, and then he looked up at her with those creekwater eyes and said the words that would change the entire direction of her life. "Follow me." That was all. 2 words, offered with the same uncomplicated directness as picking up her bag, and Adelaide Dalton, who had survived things that would have stopped other women cold, who had crossed half the country alone with a 3-month-old baby and a carpetbag and nothing but sheer determination holding her together, made the decision in a single breath. She followed him. His name was Frank Hadley. He told her this as they walked to the hitching post at the end of the platform, where a big roan horse waited with the patience of an animal that had learned patience from a patient owner. He told her he worked a cattle operation about 12 miles south of town, ran it with his older brother and 2 hired hands, had been in Cutter's Creek today to collect a supply order from the depot. He told her these things in a straightforward, no-decoration way, like reading from a ledger, except that his voice had a warmth to it that ledgers did not have. "Adelaide Dalton," she said, when it was her turn, and she braced herself for the questions that always followed. For the "where is your husband," or the "where are you from," or the "what happened," all of which she would have to answer in ways that required deciding how much truth a stranger could handle. But Frank Hadley did not ask any of those things. He untied his horse and looked at Thomas, who had gone quiet the moment they started walking, lulled by the motion of Adelaide's stride. "Boy?" he asked. "Thomas," she said. "He's 3 months. "Good solid name," Frank said, as if that was the entirety of what needed to be said on the subject. "The land mentioned in that letter is about 4 miles east of town. There's a stone marker at the road that turns off toward it. Right now there's no structure on it, just the land. You got a plan for where you're staying tonight?" Adelaide had a plan the way a person had a plan when they had read about something in a book, but had not actually done it. "I thought there might be a boarding house in town. There's one. Mrs. Hennessy runs it on the main road. She's fair, but she doesn't allow cooking in the rooms." He considered something. "She's also got a strict rule about noise after 8 in the evening." They both looked at Thomas. "Babies don't always observe the 8 o'clock rule," Adelaide admitted. "No," Frank agreed. "They generally don't." He swung up onto his horse and then looked down at her with an expression that was carefully neutral, as though he was calculating something and did not want his face to interfere with the arithmetic. "My sister-in-law Margaret runs the ranch house. She's been after me to bring someone in to help with the house since their second boy was born. It's honest work, room and board included, and it would give you time to figure out what you're doing with the land." Adelaide looked up at him sitting on that horse, this stranger who had picked up her bag and read her letter, and was now offering her a solution to a problem she had been refusing to acknowledge she had. Every practical instinct she possessed said to accept. Every proud, stubborn inch of her said to be careful. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "I know you came out here alone with a baby and a deed to 20 acres of scrubland, and you're still standing upright in July heat that would put most men on their knees," he said. "That's enough to go on." Adelaide Dalton took a breath of hot Texas air and made her second decision of the afternoon. "All right," she said. "I'll take the work." He helped her up onto the horse behind him with Thomas tucked between them, and they rode into the searing afternoon, and Adelaide noticed that he kept his posture deliberately forward, leaving as much space between them as the saddle allowed, giving her privacy and room, and she thought that said something about a person, the way they handled the awkwardness of proximity to a stranger. The Hadley Ranch was a proper operation. She could see that immediately as they came over the low rise, and the whole of it spread out below them in the late afternoon gold. There was a main house built of stone and timber with a covered porch running along the front, a barn that was bigger than the boarding house she had left in Kansas City, a bunkhouse, corrals, water troughs, and evidence everywhere of ongoing work. It was not elegant, but it was solid and real, and everything on it looked like it was being used. A woman came out onto the porch as they rode up, wiping her hands on her apron, and Adelaide registered at once that this was someone who ran things. She was perhaps 30, dark-haired, quick-eyed, with an expression that was not unfriendly but was definitely evaluating. "Frank," she said, and then her eyes found Adelaide and the baby, and they widened just slightly. "Margaret," Frank said, dismounting and handing Adelaide down with efficient care. "This is Adelaide Dalton. She arrived on the 2 o'clock train. She's got the Carver parcel east of town. I thought she might take the work you've been needing done. She can have the corner room." Margaret Hadley, who had clearly married a man cut from the same no-nonsense cloth as his brother, looked at Adelaide for a long 3 seconds and then transferred her gaze to Thomas, and something in her face shifted. "How old?" she asked. 3 months, Adelaide said. "I know it's a complication, but he's a good baby." "He sleeps well." Margaret looked at Frank. Frank looked at the middle distance. Margaret looked back at Adelaide. "Come inside," she said. "You look like you haven't eaten anything that wasn't from a train car in 3 days. 2.5, Adelaide said honestly, and Margaret almost smiled. The corner room was small but private, with a window that looked east toward the land Adelaide had not yet seen, and a quilt on the rope bed that was worn thin with washing but clean. There was a wooden crib in the corner that Margaret said had belonged to her first boy and was now just sitting empty since he had graduated to a trundle bed, and this small practical kindness almost undid Adelaide completely. She sat on the edge of the bed that first night after Thomas had finally drifted off in the crib, and she let herself have 5 minutes of quiet honesty. She thought about the man in Kansas City, Thomas's father, who had been a charming and plausible liar for exactly as long as it took him to disappear once she told him about the baby. She thought about her mother, gone from consumption the previous winter, who had been the last family she had in the world. She thought about what she had left and what she was building, and how uncertain the gap between those two things was. And then she thought about a man on a depot platform who had said "follow me" with such uncomplicated confidence that she had done it. And she let that thought sit there for exactly 1 minute before she put it away, because she was not here for anything like that. She was here to build a life for herself and Thomas, and that was enough. The work was real, and she was grateful for it. Margaret Hadley was an efficient and exacting household manager, but she was also fair, and within the first week, Adelaide had a clear sense of what was expected and how to do it well. She cooked, cleaned, washed, helped with Margaret's 2 boys who were 4 and 2 years old respectively, and full of the energy of small people who had not yet learned that the world required restraint. She was good with children. She had always known that about herself, that she had a patience for the small and the helpless that she could not always extend to adults. Frank she saw primarily at mealtimes, which were eaten all together at the long table in the kitchen. His brother, whose name was Robert, was a broader, louder version of Frank, with the same dark hair and the same fundamental decency, just delivered with more volume and more laughter. Robert was the kind of man who filled a room. Frank was the kind of man who held it steady. She noticed Frank the way you notice something reliable, the way you noticed that the sun came up on time or that the well had not gone dry. He was simply there consistently, a fixed point in the strange new geography of her days. He came in for breakfast before light, ate quickly and without fuss, asked Margaret what was needed at the end of the day, and delivered it the next morning without fail. He was unfailingly polite to Adelaide in the manner of a man who had decided that politeness was the appropriate register and was sticking to it. But Thomas complicated the register. It started at the end of the second week, when Adelaide was hanging washing and Thomas was having what she privately thought of as his afternoon philosophical crisis. which was a period of loud and inconsolable crying that had no clear cause and resisted all intervention. Frank came around the corner of the house on his way to the barn and stopped at the sight of Adelaide trying to hang a sheet with one hand while bouncing Thomas against her shoulder with the other. Her expression, the particular combination of patient and desperate that occupied new mothers. He crossed the yard without a word, took Thomas from her with the careful competence of a man who had spent time around his nephews, and stood there holding the baby while Adelaide finished the sheet. Thomas, surprised by the change in altitude and the unfamiliar chest, stopped crying and stared up at Frank with the focused concentration of an infant encountering something new. Frank looked down at him. Thomas looked up at Frank. A negotiation occurred. "He stopped," Adelaide said, watching. "He's trying to figure me out," Frank said. "Can't cry and think at the same time." Adelaide finished the sheet and turned to take Thomas back, but Frank had begun a slow walk along the fence line, the baby cradled in the crook of one arm with a naturalness that Adelaide found unsettling in a way she could not immediately name. Thomas's hand had found Frank's shirt collar and was gripping it with the iron certainty of infancy. "You don't have to do that," Adelaide said, walking alongside him. "I know," Frank said. He glanced at her sideways. "You want me to stop?" She thought about the piece of Thomas's quiet face, turned upward toward the impossible blue of the Texas sky. "No," she said, "but thank you." They walked the fence line in the late afternoon sun, and Frank pointed out the horses in the far corral and named them, one by one, because Thomas seemed interested. And Adelaide walked beside him and told herself very firmly that she was not thinking anything that she was thinking. She made herself useful in ways that went beyond the household tasks. In the third week, she discovered that the ranch's accounts had been kept in a system that had worked perfectly well, until Robert's records and Frank's records had begun crossing over each other in ways that made the books difficult to read. She asked Margaret's permission, borrowed the ledgers, and spent 2 evenings at the kitchen table reorganizing the system into something that made coherent sense. When Frank found her at it on the second evening, he sat down across from her and they went through the entries together, and she taught him the new system, and he was a quick student who asked smart questions and never pretended to understand something he did not. "Where did you learn accounting?" He asked, not with suspicion but with genuine curiosity. "My mother ran a dry goods store for 12 years after my father died," Adelaide said. "I kept the books from the time I was 14. "Smart woman," he said. "The smartest I've known," Adelaide said, and meant it. And for a moment the grief of that was right on the surface of her face before she could get it back behind her eyes. Frank saw it. She could tell he saw it because his expression changed, became quieter and more careful. But he did not reach for it, did not press his fingers into the tender place of her grief the way some people did, needing to feel useful in someone else's sorrow. He simply said, "The new system is cleaner," and went back to the ledger, and Adelaide was grateful for him in a way she did not have words for yet. The question she had been waiting for came from Robert, not Frank, on a Sunday evening when the work was done, and they were all sitting on the porch in the cooling dark. Margaret had taken the boys inside. Thomas was asleep in his basket, which Adelaide had carried out because the evening was pleasant and she wanted the air. Frank was on the far end of the porch, ostensibly checking a length of rope for wear. Robert was in the rocking chair with a directness that Adelaide had come to recognize as his default mode. "I hope you don't mind my asking," Robert said, with the tone of a man who was going to ask whether she minded or not, "but there's no father in the picture for the boy." "Robert," Frank said from the far end of the porch without looking up. "It's a fair question," Robert said. "We've got Adelaide living under our roof. She's good people. We ought to know her situation." Adelaide had prepared for this. She had prepared for it 20 different ways on the train, and she had her answer. "Thomas's father chose not to be part of our lives," she said, keeping her voice even and factual. "That was his choice to make. Thomas and I are managing well without him." Robert looked at her steadily. Whatever he saw, it seemed to satisfy whatever concern was behind the question. "All right then," he said. "Good enough for me." Frank had not looked up from the rope. But Adelaide, watching him from the corner of her eye, saw his shoulders relax a fraction, and she filed that away in the place where she was keeping things she was not ready to examine. It was in the 4th week that she first saw her land. Frank offered to take her on a Saturday afternoon, when Margaret and Robert were taking the boys to visit Margaret's sister in town, and the ranch was quiet. He saddled his horse and a gentle gray mare that he said was easy with new riders, and they rode east through the summer heat and the tall pale grass, Thomas in a cloth carrier across Adelaide's chest, which Frank had examined with careful engineering interest before declaring it structurally sound. The 20 acres were flat and dry and beautiful in the way that honest things were beautiful, without any attempt to be something they were not. There was a creek along the southern edge, thin in July but present, and a stand of cottonwood trees that meant the water table was accessible, and the stone marker at the road was exactly where the letter had said it would be. Adelaide stood at the middle of it and turned slowly, looking at the whole of it, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like something was hers. "It's going to need a well dug," Frank said, walking the perimeter with the professional attention of a man who had built things. "You'll want the house on the north end, take advantage of the tree shade in the afternoon. Good soil here for a kitchen garden." "You sound like you've thought about this," Adelaide said. He stopped and looked at her, and for a second the carefully maintained register of politeness flickered. "I've ridden past this parcel a few times," he said simply. Adelaide looked at him in the summer glare and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was in very serious trouble. She did not do anything about it. She was a practical woman, and she was a woman who had learned, at considerable cost, to be careful about the difference between what a feeling was and what a situation was. Frank Hadley had been kind to her. He worked on his family's ranch. She worked in his family's house. She had a baby from another man and 20 acres of raw land and a plan that was still mostly theoretical. A feeling, however clear, was not a circumstance, so she was careful. She was careful and she was sensible, and she threw herself into the work of the ranch and the project of her land. And Frank was helpful in the way he had always been helpful, which was to say constantly and without drama, and she managed very well for 3 more weeks until the afternoon that Thomas said his first sound. It was not a word. He was 4 months old and words were a long way off. But he made a sound, a clear, deliberate sound that was distinctly different from crying or fussing, a small, bright syllable of delight, and he made it not to Adelaide but to Frank, who was sitting across the kitchen table from her in the late afternoon, helping her update the supply ledger, and Thomas was in his basket on the table between them because he had been fussy and only settled when he could see both of them. Frank made a face at Thomas, the specific ridiculous face he had been making at the baby for weeks when he thought Adelaide was not watching, the one with the exaggerated wide eyes and the pursed lips, and Thomas made the sound, clear as a bell, completely intentional. Frank's face did something remarkable. The careful neutral register dissolved entirely and he smiled, a real and unguarded smile that started in his eyes and worked its way to the rest of him, and he said, "Well, there you go, buddy," in a voice so soft it barely made it across the table. Adelaide was looking at him when it happened, and the feeling she had been carefully managing for weeks rose up with such force that she had to press her hands flat against the table to keep herself present in the room. Frank looked up and found her watching him, and for 3 full seconds neither of them looked away, and the afternoon light was amber and exact, and the ledger sat between them like an unanswered question. Then Thomas made the sound again, demanding acknowledgement, and Frank made the face again, and Adelaide laughed, and the moment passed into something softer and less dangerous, and they both pretended nothing had happened, but things had happened. They happened again in the evening 11 days later, when Adelaide was coming back from checking the chickens and Frank was sitting on the back steps in the last of the light, not doing anything in particular, which was unusual enough for him that she stopped. "Are you all right?" she asked. He looked up. "Thinking," he said. She sat down on the step below him because there was no room on the same step with both of them, and they looked at the darkening sky together for a while, which was something she had noticed people in Texas did with a frequency that people in Kansas City never had, as though the sky here was so large it demanded periodic acknowledgement. "My father left this ranch to Robert and me equal," Frank said after a while, "but Robert has Margaret and the boys and the house makes sense for a family. I've been thinking about building my own place." "On the ranch land?" Adelaide asked. "Or near it?" He paused. "There's a parcel east of here that would suit a house well." Adelaide kept her eyes on the sky. "That parcel east of here," she said carefully, "is about 4 miles out." "I know," Frank said. Another pause longer than the first. The evening star appeared. "Frank," Adelaide said, and then stopped because she did not know what she was going to say. "Adelaide," he said, and his voice had changed into something she had not heard from him before, something lower and more deliberate, and she turned to look at him and found him already looking at her. "I'm not very good at this," he said. "I've been told I say things so plain they come out wrong, so I'm going to say it plain and hope for the best." "All right," she said. "I think you're the most capable and remarkable woman I have ever met," he said. "And I have thought that since you stood on that depot platform in July heat with a baby and a carpetbag, and the kind of composure that most people can't manage in their own living rooms. And I am aware that your situation is complicated and that you have plans of your own for your land and your life, and I am not trying to complicate those. But I would be a poor kind of man if I sat here any longer and didn't tell you that I would very much like to be part of those plans, if you were ever to want that." Adelaide sat with that for a long moment. Below them, somewhere in the barn, one of the horses moved in its stall. From the house came the distant sound of Robert's laughter at something Margaret had said. "You know everything about me," she said, and it was both a question and not one. "I know what I've seen," he said. "I know you're good and you're honest and you work harder than anyone here and you love that boy with every piece of yourself. The rest of it is your history and it belongs to you." "Thomas's father was a man who told me what I wanted to hear," she said, and she heard her own voice saying it as though from a slight distance, measured and factual. "He was very convincing, and when it stopped being convenient, he was gone. I am not, as a result, particularly trusting of things that sound too good." "That's a fair position," Frank said, "and I'm not asking you to trust me on the strength of 6 weeks and good intentions. I'm asking if you're willing to find out." Adelaide Dalton, who was 26 years old and had made every significant decision of her adult life with her head because her heart had been demonstrably unreliable, looked at this man on the back porch steps in the last of the summer light and made a decision with something she had not used in a long time. "Ask me again in the spring," she said, "when I've broken ground on the house." It was not a no. They both knew it was not a no. Frank nodded, and his expression was the one she associated with a man who had been told something worth waiting for, and they sat there together in the evening dark a while longer, not touching but close, and the closeness had a different quality now, acknowledged and honest. He did not ask again. He waited as he said he would, but the waiting was not passive. The waiting was Frank appearing at her land on 3 separate Saturdays in September with tools and lumber, and 2 of the hired hands he had convinced to give their time for a fair day's wage, and the hole for a well being dug in the north end of the property, and a foundation being laid of the same stone that lined the creek. It was Frank finding Adelaide in the kitchen one evening with the ranch's supply list, and quietly suggesting that the dry goods order might be combined with her own list to save her a trip. And then, when she mentioned she was short on funds for a full order of glass panes, going away and returning with a price agreement from the man at the glass works in town that Adelaide knew perfectly well had been negotiated with Frank's own credit standing as guarantee. She confronted him about it directly because she was an honest woman. "I saw the bill of credit," she said. "Your name is on it." "Is there a problem with the glass?" he asked. "No, there is not a problem with the glass, Frank Hadley. There is a problem with you putting yourself financially responsible for my purchases without my knowledge. He had the grace to look mildly chastened. You needed the glass, I had the credit, it was practical. Don't do it again without asking me, she said. All right, he said and met her eyes. I'm sorry, I meant it to help, not to step over you. I know you did, she said. That's the only reason we're talking about it and not fighting about it. The corners of his mouth moved. Is there a distinction? There is a very significant distinction, she said, and she was trying not to smile and failing. The autumn in the Texas Panhandle came in golds and rusts, and a wind that had changed its character from the killing heat of summer to something that suggested possibility. Adelaide rode out to her land on a morning in October, Thomas in the carrier against her chest, and looked at the stone foundation and the dug well and the stack of dressed lumber that was waiting for walls. And she stood there in the cool morning and felt something that she identified cautiously as hope. Thomas had found his feet and his voice by then. He was 7 months old, dark-haired like Adelaide's father had been, with a disposition that was curious and sunny and untroubled, and the entire Hadley household had been comprehensively conquered by him. Margaret had declared him a useful addition to the household by virtue of entertaining her youngest boy for entire stretches of the morning. Robert called him Tom and taught him to clap by clapping himself, endlessly and loudly, which Margaret found less charming than Robert did. And Frank carried him on his shoulders on slow walks around the yard at dusk, which Thomas found magnificent, and made him serious conversation about horses and fence work and the state of the autumn grass, and Thomas responded with the focused attention of a person who could not yet speak but was clearly storing everything for later. Adelaide watched this and did not put it away anymore. She let herself watch it, and she let herself feel what it made her feel, which was something large and specific and terrifying in the way that good things were terrifying when you had been without them for long enough. It was Margaret who said it first, because Margaret was direct in the way that women who ran things were direct. He's in love with you, Margaret said, on a Tuesday morning when they were preserving the last of the autumn apples together at the kitchen stove. He's been in love with you since about the 2nd week, and he's waiting for you to be ready, which is either very patient or very stubborn depending on how you look at it. Adelaide stirred the preserves. He told you that. He didn't have to tell me anything. I've known that man since I married Robert 11 years ago. Frank doesn't sit on back steps in the dark with people he's indifferent to. My situation is complicated, Adelaide said. Everyone's situation is complicated, Margaret said, with the crisp efficiency of a woman who had heard that particular sentence before. You're smart and you're careful, and those are good qualities. But there's a point past which careful becomes an excuse to avoid something you want because you're afraid it will hurt, and I've watched you getting close to that point. Adelaide was quiet for a long moment. What if it goes wrong? What if it goes right? Margaret said. She reached over and took the spoon from Adelaide and stirred with the authority of a woman ending a discussion. I'm not telling you to do anything you're not ready for. I'm just telling you that the window on a good man's patience is not infinite, and Frank is patient, but he's not made of stone. Adelaide thought about that for 3 days, and on the 4th day, a Thursday, she saddled the gray mare after the morning work and rode out to the land alone because Margaret had offered to watch Thomas, and she stood in the center of it again as she had in July, and she turned in a slow circle, looking at the foundation and the well and the lumber and the cottonwoods along the creek and the enormous Texas sky above all of it. She thought about what she was building: a house, a life, a home for Thomas. Something that was hers, that no person could take from her because it was her name on the deed and her name alone. She had done that. She had come out here with nothing, and in 3 months she had work and a room and a foundation being laid, and she had done it herself. But she had not done it entirely herself, and the specific ways in which she had not done it entirely herself all had Frank Hadley's name on them, and she had known since at least September, if she was honest, which she was always trying to be, that she was not actually afraid of whether it was going to hurt. She was afraid of how much she already wanted it not to. She rode back to the ranch in the afternoon light, and Frank was in the corral working with a young horse, and she leaned on the fence rail and watched him, and when he noticed her standing there, he slowed the horse to a walk and came toward her. "You rode out to the land," he said. It was not a question. He could tell by the dust on her boots and the direction she had come from. "I did," she said. She looked at him across the fence rail. "I thought about what you said in August, on the steps." He went very still, the way a man went still when he needed to hear clearly and didn't want any movement to interfere. "I think," Adelaide said, "that I have been waiting to see whether I would stop wanting you to be part of my plans, and I have not stopped. In fact, the wanting has gotten considerably worse over the last 2 months, which is inconvenient because I have a great deal to do." He was quiet for a moment. The young horse shifted behind him. "Is this you saying yes?" Frank asked. "I am saying," Adelaide said carefully, "that I would like you to come to dinner with me in town on Friday evening. Just you and me, not the whole household. And we will see what we are and what we want, and we will do it properly. Is that acceptable?" The expression on his face was the one she had first seen in the kitchen over a ledger and baby Thomas's first deliberate sound, the one that dismantled the neutral register completely and let her see what was actually there. And what was actually there was very worth seeing. "That," Frank Hadley said, "is more than acceptable." Dinner at the hotel in Cutter's Creek on a Friday evening in October of 1878 was not a grand affair. The hotel dining room had 6 tables, oil lamps that smoked slightly, a menu chalked on a board above the kitchen door, and a proprietor's wife who served the food and watched them with unconcealed interest from the kitchen doorway. Adelaide wore the best dress she had, which was a deep blue wool that had been her mother's and had been let out at the waist after Thomas but was otherwise good, and Frank wore a clean white shirt and dark vest and had clearly taken considerable care with his appearance, which she found touching. They talked for 3 hours. Not about the ranch or the land or Thomas or practical matters, but about everything else, all the things that 2 people who had been carefully circling each other for months had not yet said. Frank told her about growing up on a ranch in New Mexico with Robert and their parents, about the father who had taught him to read with the single-minded insistence of a man who believed that land without literacy was a trap, about coming to Texas because the grass was different and the sky was different, and he had needed to be somewhere that was not entirely familiar. Adelaide told him about Kansas City and her mother's store, and the years of keeping books and managing inventory and watching her mother build something from grief and practicality, and about the dreams she had for the 20 acres that went beyond a house and a kitchen garden, about how she wanted a real farm, livestock and a proper garden, and eventually an orchard if the water table held. About how Thomas was going to grow up knowing that the land he stood on was his mother's, and it was built with her own hands. Frank listened to all of it the way he listened to everything, with full attention and no hurry, and when she was done he said, "You're going to need more hands than yours when planting season comes." And it was such a Frank thing to say, so direct and practical, that she laughed until the proprietor's wife came out of the kitchen doorway to see what was happening. They walked back through the town after dinner in the cool autumn air, and Frank offered his arm and she took it, and they walked the length of the main street and back again, and at the hitching post where the horses waited he turned to her and said, "I want to do this again, as many times as you'll let me." "Next Friday," she said. "Next Friday," he agreed. He helped her mount and they rode back to the ranch under a sky absolutely riddled with stars, the kind of sky that cities never had and the Texas panhandle wore like a crown, and Adelaide rode beside him and felt something she had not felt in so long she had almost stopped believing it existed. She felt safe. Not the passive safety of walls and locks, but the active safety of knowing someone was on your side, the safety of being known by someone and not diminished by the knowing. She felt it the way she felt the cool autumn air, as something present and real and moving around her. The Fridays became a particular structure in her life, a point of the week she moved toward with pleasure. They rode into town, they had dinner, they walked and talked and learned each other in the specific cumulative way that people did when they were serious about knowing someone. They argued twice, with the productive kind of argument that happened between people who were both accustomed to being right and had to negotiate what that meant between them. Once about whether the house on her land should have 2 rooms or 3 to start, Frank arguing for the practical minimum, Adelaide arguing that the practical minimum now would be the regretted inadequate later, and she won that one cleanly. Once about whether Frank ought to have intervened when one of the hired hands spoke to Adelaide with a rudeness that Frank had witnessed, and she had already handled herself before Frank could do anything about it, and Frank had to concede that she had handled it and did not need him to revisit it on her behalf. "I am capable of managing rudeness," she said. "I know you are," he said. "I was rude myself. I wanted to say something." "Channel the want into something useful," she said. "Like lumber." He showed up the next Saturday with more lumber for the house. Thomas's first real word came in November, on a Sunday morning at the breakfast table. He was 8 months old and had been working up to it for weeks, making purposeful sounds that were clearly headed somewhere. The full household was at the table, Margaret and Robert and their boys, Frank, Adelaide with Thomas in her lap. Thomas reached across Adelaide's arm toward Frank, who was sitting beside her, and said, "Duh." The table went completely silent. Frank looked at the baby. The baby looked at Frank with absolute certainty, the kind of certainty that 8-month-olds had when they knew exactly what they meant. Robert started to say something. Margaret put her hand on Robert's arm. Adelaide was watching Frank's face, and what she saw there would stay with her for the rest of her life. The word had hit him somewhere deep and unguarded, somewhere he had not prepared for, and for just a moment everything he felt was completely visible. The ache and the tenderness and something that was very close to a question. And he looked from the baby to Adelaide with eyes that were saying something her name did not have a word for yet. "He's been doing that," Adelaide said quietly. "Reaching toward you, saying that sound. I wasn't sure if I should tell you." Frank set down his fork. He took a breath. He reached over carefully and let Thomas take his finger, which the baby gripped with both hands and examined with great seriousness. "Adelaide," Frank said, and his voice was measured but only just, "I need to say something, and I need to say it now and not wait for Friday." Everyone at the table was frozen. Margaret had a serving spoon suspended halfway between a dish and Robert's plate. "I am," Frank said, "deeply and entirely in love with you. I have been since somewhere around the 3rd week of August, though I suspect it started earlier and I was just slow to name it. And I am telling you this now, in front of everyone, because Thomas just gave me something I did not know I wanted, and I am not going to sit here and pretend otherwise." He paused. "I would like to marry you if you would have me, and I would like to be Thomas's father if he would have me, which based on available evidence suggests he might." Adelaide looked at this man, this steady, plain-spoken, extraordinarily reliable man who had picked up her bag on a platform in July because it was the right thing to do and had not stopped doing right things since, and felt the last careful piece of distance she had been keeping dissolve entirely. "You are asking me in front of your whole family," she said. "I am aware of that. On a Sunday morning. Also aware. Before I have finished my coffee." "Adelaide," he said, and the way he said her name was the way you said something you had been thinking about for a long time. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Frank, I will marry you." Robert made a sound like a man who had been holding his breath for months. Margaret set the serving spoon down very carefully and pressed both hands to her face in the manner of a woman who was choosing happiness over dignity. The 2 small boys, understanding nothing but the energy of the room, began to clap. Thomas, still holding Frank's finger, made the sound again. "Duh." Frank turned to him and smiled, and it was the same smile Adelaide had first seen over the ledger, the one that dismantled everything, and she thought, with the clear certainty of someone who has finally stopped arguing with herself, that she would spend the rest of her life happy to see it. They married in December. in the church at Cutter's Creek that had a drafty east wall and a preacher who spoke with great conviction about the sanctity of the union and the importance of community, which Adelaide found appropriately pointed given that the entirety of their community had been following this development with the interest that frontier towns reserved for the most compelling events, which in the absence of anything more dramatic was apparently the romance of the new woman at the Hadley ranch. Margaret made Adelaide's dress from ivory wool that she had ordered from Dallas with a forethought Adelaide had not known to attribute to her until she saw the dress and understood it had been ordered in September. Robert gave a speech at the supper afterward that was long and occasionally wandering and entirely good-natured, and made Frank look at the ceiling in the way of a man enduring something lovingly. Adelaide wore her mother's earrings, small garnets in gold settings, and carried a small bunch of dried prairie flowers because it was December and that was what December in Texas offered, and she thought her mother would have liked this. She thought her mother would have looked at Frank Hadley and said, in the way she had said everything, plain and true, "There is a man who knows what he is." Thomas wore a small white shirt and fell asleep during the ceremony and had to be passed to Robert, who held him with the easy competence of a man who had held a great many small people, and Thomas slept through his parents' vows and woke up for the supper, which struck Adelaide as a reasonable set of priorities. They spent the first months of their marriage at the ranch, Adelaide managing the house and the accounts, and riding out to her land twice a week to watch the progress of the walls going up, Frank working the ranch and giving every Saturday to the building project, which had expanded from a 2-room house to a 3-room house because Adelaide had been right about that. By February, the house was standing, stone walls and timber roof and glass panes in every window, and a covered porch that looked south over the creek and the cottonwoods, and Adelaide stood in the middle of the main room with Thomas on her hip and the walls around her, and felt the precise fulfillment of the promise she had made to herself on the platform in July. It was hers. Built with her name and her money and the work of her own hands, and the hands of a man who had decided she was worth the building, and it was exactly enough. They moved into the house in March of 1879, Frank and Adelaide and Thomas and everything they owned, which was not a great deal but was enough and growing. Frank had a string of horses he had been training through the winter, good quarter horses that he sold to the cattle operations in the region, and this was the beginning of what would become his proper livelihood, separate from but connected to the ranch he and Robert shared, a horse training and breeding operation that suited him the way the work suited him, patiently and with deep competence. Adelaide planted her kitchen garden in March and put in proper rows of beans and squash and corn and tomatoes, and dug a section for a proper herb garden that her mother had always said was the difference between cooking and eating. She ordered 3 laying hens from the feed store in town and built a coop for them with Frank's help, and she bought 2 young goats from a homesteader 2 miles east who was moving back east, and she named them Margaret and Robert to Frank's great private amusement and his firm insistence that they not tell his brother. Thomas took his first steps in April, across the stone floor of the main room, arms wide in expression one of complete personal triumph, and Frank caught him at the other end and tossed him gently in the air, and Thomas's laugh was the finest thing Adelaide had ever heard. Spring came in full across the panhandle, and with it came the business of the land in earnest. Adelaide was not a woman who did things halfway. The 20 acres that had been scrubland in July of 1878 were becoming something real, organized into kitchen garden and a larger field for corn and the beginning of what she had planned as an orchard along the southern fence line. A dozen young peach and apple trees ordered from a nursery in Fort Worth and planted in rows with the kind of forward investment that only made sense if you believed you were going to be somewhere long enough to see them grow. She was going to be somewhere. She had never been more certain of anything. The town of Cutter's Creek was a town in the process of becoming itself, and Adelaide and Frank were becoming part of it in the way that people became part of a place, not through a single act but through accumulation. Adelaide began keeping the books for two other businesses in town, the feed store and the dry goods operation, for a fair fee, and the precision of her accounting gave her a reputation that preceded her in ways that were occasionally startling. Frank's horses were moving through the region, and his name with them. They were known as the Hadleys of the East Parcel, which Adelaide found quietly satisfying, because it was her parcel and her name, and it was still both of those things. There were difficulties. There was a drought in the early summer of 1879 that made the creek drop and the garden labor twice as hard, and the young orchard trees require carrying water by hand in buckets from the well, which Adelaide and Frank did in the mornings and evenings of June and July and August, until the monsoon finally came through in September and filled the creek back up, and she stood in the rain with her face turned up like Thomas did. There was a month when 3 of Frank's horses were sick with something the traveling veterinarian diagnosed as a respiratory illness that required careful nursing and cost them 2 of the 3. And Frank came home from the pasture one evening with a closed face and sat at the table, and Adelaide sat down across from him and did not say anything encouraging because that was not what was needed, and they sat together in the quiet, and eventually Frank said, "I'll start again," and she said, "I know." And that was enough. There was also the matter of Ben Collier. Ben Collier was a man in town who ran a land operation that involved acquiring parcels from homesteaders who ran into financial difficulty, and who had taken an interest in Adelaide's 20 acres that she found presumptuous from the first time he mentioned it, which was at the dry goods store one afternoon in April, where he had presented himself, and his interest in a way that suggested he expected both his presence and his offer to be welcomed. "You're a woman on your own out there," he said, which was both factually wrong and intended as a pressure point. "I am a woman on my own land," Adelaide said, "with a husband and a deed in my name and no interest in your offer." Collier had looked at her with the particular expression of a man who had expected a different kind of woman and was recalibrating. "Your husband might see things differently. You are welcome to ask him," Adelaide said, "and I would genuinely enjoy being present for that conversation." Frank, when she told him that evening, had the same expression she had seen on the steps in August, the careful neutral one over something warmer and more emphatic. "What did you say to him?" "What needed to be said. He won't trouble me again." Frank considered this. "And if he does, then I'll handle it again," she said, "and you can bring lumber." He had brought her a fence post that week, which she thought was his own form of poetry. Ben Collier did not come back. Whatever he had decided after Adelaide's response, the Hadley parcel was no longer on his list of available opportunities, and he moved his attentions to other things, and the 20 acres continued to be exactly what they had always been, which was hers. The autumn of 1879 brought the first real harvest from Adelaide's fields. Not a large one, not enough to be a commercial operation yet, but enough to fill the root cellar that Frank had dug along the north wall of the house in August, and enough to feel like a real return on the investment of that year's work. She stood in her root cellar in October and looked at rows of preserved jars and bunches of dried herbs and sacks of dried corn, and felt the specific satisfaction of a woman who has fed her family from her own land for the first time and knows she can do it again. Thomas walked everywhere by then, and talked with great determination in his own language that was beginning to align more and more with the actual words of English, and followed Frank around the property with the focused dedication of a person who had decided that this was his primary education and intended to pursue it seriously. Frank took him seriously, which was what Thomas needed, and explained things to him at a child-appropriate level that Thomas absorbed with wide eyes and periodic nodding that made Adelaide press her hand to her mouth to keep from laughing out loud. Frank was a good father. Not just a good father in the abstract, patient and present and kind, but a good father in the specific and daily details. The consistency of it, the showing up every single morning and evening regardless of what the day had been, the reading to Thomas in the evenings from the books that Frank's own father had insisted upon, the teaching of small tasks with the belief that a child who understood how things worked would grow up to be someone who could handle them. Adelaide loved him for all of it, but she loved him for that particularly, for the way he had taken Thomas as his own without ever making it a statement or a performance, without ever making Adelaide feel that it was a concession, because it was not a concession, it was simply what he was. She told him this one evening in November, after Thomas was in bed and they were sitting by the fire in the main room with the wind coming in off the panhandle in the way it did in November, full of force and intention. "I want you to know," she said, "that I see it, every day, what you do for him." Frank looked up from the harness he was mending. "He's my son," he said, as though that settled it, which it did. "Yes," Adelaide said, "he is." The fire said something in its own language, and they sat with that, and Adelaide thought that this was what she had not known to want, this specific and ordinary evening, this room and this fire and this man across from her, and she thought that the path from the depot platform in July to here had been exactly the right distance, not too long and not too short, long enough for her to know that it was real. In the spring of 1880, Adelaide told Frank she was expecting another baby. She told him in the kitchen in the morning before Thomas was awake, because she wanted to see his face without an audience. She had known for 3 weeks and had been carrying the knowledge carefully, feeling it out, getting used to the shape of it. Frank set down his coffee cup. He looked at her across the kitchen table with the creek-water eyes that she knew now in every light, in sun and rain and firelight and the particular gray of early mornings, and what was in them was clear and uncomplicated. "Adelaide," he said. "I know," she said, which was their shorthand for conversations that did not need all their words. He came around the table and put his arms around her, and she leaned into him in the morning kitchen, and they stood there for a long time with the early light coming through the east window and Thomas's occasional stirring sounds coming from the other room, and Adelaide felt the life she had built press up against her from every direction, warm and full and entirely real. The baby came in November of 1880, a healthy boy they named James Robert, James for Adelaide's father and Robert for Frank's brother, who was so thoroughly delighted by the honor that he came out to the house with a bottle of good whiskey and a hand-carved wooden horse that he had spent 3 months making, which Frank noted with the straight face of a man deeply enjoying himself. Thomas was 2.5. And his reaction to James was the careful and proprietary interest of a child who has been told this was his brother and is taking the responsibility seriously. He brought James small objects of significance, a smooth stone from the creek, a blue ribbon, a wooden spoon from the kitchen, laying them in a row beside the crib with the seriousness of an official ceremony, and Adelaide watched this and loved both her sons so entirely that she did not know what to do with the size of it except let it be. Frank held James the first night in the way he had held Thomas on the depot platform, with the natural competence of a man who had learned that things worth holding required steadiness, and he looked at Adelaide over the baby's head with an expression that was simple and complete. "Thank you," he said, and she knew he did not mean only for the baby. "Thank you," she said back, and meant the same. The years moved in the way that good years moved, full of work and weather and the daily accumulation of a life. The Hadley parcel grew steadily through 1881 and 1882. The kitchen garden expanded. The orchard trees put on real growth. The livestock became a proper small operation with milk goats and laying hens, and eventually a pair of young pigs that Thomas named with great ceremony, and that everyone pretended not to notice were destined for the winter table. Frank's horse operation was by 1882 one of the better regarded in the region, and he hired a young man named Eli, who was 19 and had come to Cutter's Creek on a westbound train from Tennessee, and reminded Adelaide, with a quality she could not precisely name, of herself in July of 1878. She made sure he had proper meals and a clear accounting of his wages, and she kept track of what he needed in the same way she had once kept track of what she needed, practically and without sentimentality. The town of Cutters Creek by 1882 was a real place, with a school and a church with a repaired east wall and 2 competing dry goods operations, and a proper hotel and a barber and a dentist who came through on alternating months, and a doctor who was there all the time. Adelaide was on the school board by 1882, a position she had been asked to take, and had accepted with the understanding that Thomas would be enrolled when he was old enough, which he was, in the autumn of that year, and watching him walk into the schoolhouse with his slate and his reader was one of the defining images of Adelaide's life. This boy she had carried across half the country on her chest being walked into his future by his own feet. Frank walked with her back from the schoolhouse that first morning, and they were both quiet for a while, and then he said, "He's going to be fine," and she said, "I know," and it was true, he already was. The drought came again in 1883, harder than 1879, and this one was severe enough to take 3 of the orchard trees that Adelaide had been tending for 4 years. She stood at the dead trees on a September afternoon and put her hand on the bark of the largest one, a peach that had given its first real fruit in 1882, and felt the specific grief of losing something you had tended, different from other griefs but real. Frank found her there. He came and stood beside her and looked at the tree and did not say anything immediately, which was what she needed. "I'll order new stock from Fort Worth," she said. "I'll put in a second cistern," he said, "so we have reserves next time." "Next time," she said, and the phrase carried them both, because that was what they had always done, expected the next time and prepared for it. The cistern went in before winter. The new trees were ordered and planted in the spring of 1884. The orchard in the summer of 1887 would be the thing Adelaide pointed to when she wanted to show someone what persistence looked like. 16 trees in full production along the south fence, peach and apple, and a pair of pear trees that had been a late addition, and the whole thing filling the air in the summer with a smell that was better than anything she had experienced in Kansas City or anywhere else. James was 7 in 1887 and Thomas was 9, and they were boys of the land in the way that children were when they had grown up on it, knowing it by touch and smell and season, full of opinions about weather and soil and the relative merits of different apples, which they debated with great seriousness. Thomas had Frank's steadiness and Adelaide's precision. James had Robert's volume and Adelaide's mother's practicality, a combination that Adelaide found both familiar and startling. In the spring of 1884, Adelaide discovered she was expecting again, and this time she told Frank at the orchard, standing in the early April green of the new growth, and he laughed, which was not what she expected, and then explained that he was laughing because he was happy and was not yet very good at having feelings show up as the right expression. "You're getting better at it," she said. "I'm working on it," he said. The baby was a girl, born in October of 1884, and they named her Clara Ruth. Clara because it had always been Adelaide's favorite name that she had never used, and Ruth for Adelaide's mother whose name had been Ruth, and who had left 20 acres of Texas scrubland in her daughter's name like the most determined act of love Adelaide had ever witnessed. Clara was, from the very first day, her own person, which was the thing Adelaide found most interesting about children, how thoroughly they arrived already knowing what they were. Clara was loud and certain, and had Frank's eye color and Adelaide's expression, the one that said she was thinking something 3 steps ahead of what she was willing to share. And Frank, who was not afraid of very many things, occasionally looked at his daughter with the expression of a man who was experiencing appropriate awe. Thomas adored Clara the way older siblings adored much younger ones, with the proprietary tenderness of a person who had been in the house longest and therefore felt responsibility. James was less certain of her initially but came around by the time she was walking, because Clara walked directly to James on her first real day of mobility, took his hand, and looked at him with complete confidence, and James had never really recovered from being chosen. Robert Hadley died in the winter of 1885, suddenly, from a heart that had apparently been making a private decision for some time. It was a hard winter in many senses. Frank and Robert had been the architecture of each other's adult life, the way brothers were when they had built things together, and the loss of him was quiet and enormous in Frank in the way that the largest things were quiet. Adelaide sat with him through it, not filling the silence but being present inside it, which was what she had learned from him. That presence was not the same as noise. Margaret took the ranch and ran it herself with the 2 hired hands and her oldest boy, who at 16 was stepping into the shape of what he would become, and Adelaide rode over twice a week through the winter to help with what was needed. And in the spring, they sat on Margaret's porch and talked about Robert the way people talked about people they had loved when enough time had passed to hold the love and the grief in the same hand. "He liked you from the first evening," Margaret said. "He asked me extremely direct questions from the first evening," Adelaide said. "That was his way of saying he liked you. He asked strangers nothing." Adelaide looked at the spring sky. "He was a good man." "He was," Margaret said, "and his brother is too. Same metal, different casting." Adelaide thought about that for a long time afterward. Same metal, different casting, and thought that it was exactly right, and that she had known it from the steps on the first evening, that Frank was built of the same fundamental material as his family, something reliable and honest and warm, and that she had come to know the particular shape of him over 7 years in the way that you knew something you depended on absolutely. She told him this, that same metal different casting thing, on a summer evening in 1886 on their own porch, looking south over the creek and the grown cottonwoods that were now tall enough to give real shade in the afternoons. Thomas was inside reading. James was in the barn with Eli. Clara was asleep finally after an evening of determined non-sleeping that had required the creative application of 3 separate stories and a slow walk around the yard. "Margaret said that," Adelaide said, "about you and Robert, same metal, different casting." Frank was quiet for a moment. "She knows us well." "She does," Adelaide said. She looked at him in the summer evening, this man she had been married to for 7 years, and felt a wave of something that was not different from what she had felt on the steps in August of 1878, but was richer and deeper and fuller. The way a river was fuller than a creek, the same water but more of it. "I think I knew it on the platform," she said, "that you were worth following." He turned to look at her. "2 words," he said. "That's all I said." "Follow me," Adelaide said. It was enough. He took her hand on the porch in the summer evening, and they sat there together in the way they had sat on steps and at tables and by fires, through drought and loss and harvest and children and all the ordinary extraordinary weather of a life built together. And the cottonwoods said something in the evening wind, and the creek was full, and the orchard was in fruit, and everything that had been built was standing. In 1887, Thomas turned 11, and Adelaide started teaching him accounting in the evenings, sitting at the kitchen table with the ledgers the way her mother had sat with her in the back of the dry goods store in Kansas City. He was quick with numbers and had the specific attention to detail that made a person good at it, and Adelaide watched him working through an entry with the focused expression she recognized as her own and felt the continuity of it, her mother's store to her land to this table, the thing passing forward. Frank watched from the doorway one evening and said nothing, but the expression on his face was the fully open one, the one that had no neutral register in it, and Adelaide caught his eye over Thomas's bent head, and they were in complete agreement without a word. James, at 7, was discovering that he had a quality with animals that went beyond the ordinary, a patience and a sensitivity that made Frank's horses respond to him in ways they did not respond to other people. Frank began including him deliberately in the horsework, taking him through the training process with the same careful explanation he gave to everything, and James absorbed it the way the land absorbed rain, completely and at depth. Clara at 3 was a force of nature. This was not a metaphor. She had opinions about everything and the vocabulary to express them, and the persistence to continue expressing them, until the world had caught up with her view of it. And Adelaide recognized herself so thoroughly in this that she could not decide whether to laugh or take precautions. "She's going to run something," Frank said, watching Clara direct both her brothers in some project of her own devising in the yard. "She's already running this family," Adelaide said. "She is," Frank agreed. He sounded entirely comfortable with this. The school at Cutter's Creek grew through the late 1880s as the town grew, and Adelaide's position on the school board became increasingly active as she pushed for a second teacher, a proper library collection, and eventually a curriculum that included arithmetic for all students without exception, girls included, because Adelaide Dalton Hadley was not a woman who was going to sit on a school board and watch arithmetic be treated as optional for half the students. There was debate about this, as there was debate about everything, from men on the board who had opinions about the appropriate education of girls that Adelaide found both wrong and tiresome. She argued her case with the precision of a woman who had kept books since 14 and built a farm from 20 acres of scrubland, and could cite chapter and verse on the economic advantages of a literate and numerate population. She won the argument cleanly, and the curriculum changed, and she knew that it changed not just for Clara, but for every girl who would come through that school after. There was an injustice in that, in the fact that it needed arguing at all, and Adelaide argued it with full awareness of that injustice and no apology for naming it. Frank appeared at the school board meeting on the evening of the final vote, which was not required of him, and was not something she had asked for. He sat in the back of the room and voted, as a member of the community, in favor of the curriculum change, and afterward she asked him why he had come. "Because you were fighting something important," he said, "and it's easier to fight important things when someone is in your corner." She thought about the platform in July, about the fact that he had picked up the bag without being asked, had said "follow me" without any information beyond what was in front of him, and she thought that this was the same quality expressed in 1,000 different forms, the fundamental inclination toward someone who needed something and the lack of hesitation about giving it. "You have been in my corner," she said, "since the day we met." "I plan to stay there," he said. The orchard in the summer of 1889 was the best it had ever been. Adelaide stood in it on a July morning, 10 years and 2 days after she had arrived at the Cutter's Creek depot with a carpetbag and a baby and nothing else, and looked at 16 trees in full fruit and a kitchen garden that had been extended twice, and a root cellar that would be full by October, and a farmhouse built of stone that had not shifted in 10 years of Texas weather, and she felt the sum of the decade in her bones. Thomas was 12, James was 9, Clara was 5. Frank was riding the south pasture with a new horse he was training for a ranch family 2 counties over, and she could see him at the far edge of the property, just the shape of him and the horse against the morning sky, and she thought about July of 1878, and she thought about all the Julys since, and she thought that she had built exactly what she had come to build, and more. She had come for the land. She had found the land, and she had found a life on it, a real and full and honest life, and she had done it with the kind of person who picked up your bag on a platform because it was the right thing to do, and she was grateful for both the land and the person with a depth that she carried quietly every day. Frank came in at noon, and they ate at the kitchen table with Thomas and James, Clara in her chair with the particular dignity of a 5-year-old who is fully aware of her place in the order of things. The kitchen had Adelaide's herbs drying from the rafters and sunlight through the east window and the smell of bread cooling on the counter, and Frank looked up from his plate and found her watching him and smiled the smile she had first seen in the kitchen over a ledger 8 years ago, and it had not changed at all. "What?" he said. 11 years ago next month," she said, "I stepped off a train in this town." "I know," he said. "I was there." Thomas looked between them with the expression of a 12-year-old who sensed the existence of a story he had only pieces of. "You met at the train station. Your father picked up my bag," Adelaide said. "And said, 'Follow me,'" Frank said, "which she did, which I am grateful for every single day." Thomas considered this with the solemnity it deserved. James, whose interest in romance was still some years off, returned to his food. Clara looked at her parents with the assessment of someone who was categorizing everything for future use. "That's how it was," Thomas said. "That's exactly how it was," Adelaide said. She reached across the table and put her hand over Frank's, and he turned his hand and held hers. And the kitchen was full of bread and herbs and light and children, and all the layers of a life they had built from a carpetbag and 2 words on a platform. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly and entirely everything. In the autumn of 1889, the Hadley land at the East Parcel produced its first real commercial harvest, with enough preserved goods to supply the dry goods store in town with a contract for the following spring. Adelaide signed that contract herself and brought it home and put it on the kitchen table, and Frank read it and looked at her and said, "Your mother would be proud." And Adelaide held those words in her chest for a very long time. The young peach trees along the south fence were 9 years old and producing more fruit than they could put up, and Adelaide arranged with the hotel kitchen to take the surplus at a fair price, which became an ongoing arrangement that added to the farm's income in a way that made the accounts look, by the end of 1889, genuinely solid. Thomas at 12 showed every sign of becoming the kind of person who made things work, methodical and reliable, and possessed of a stubbornness that his mother recognized as her own, which Frank pointed out with considerable quiet amusement on a regular basis. He had taken over his own section of the farm records with seriousness and accuracy, and Frank told Adelaide privately that the boy had more financial sense at 12 than most men he had done business with, which was both a compliment to Thomas and a fairly direct commentary on some of Frank's business associates. James at 9 had become indispensable to the horse operation, and Eli, who was now 28 and had been with them for 7 years, and was as much a part of the household as anyone who did not sleep under the roof, deferred to James on matters of horse temperament with a naturalness that suggested no formal decision had been made, only an obvious fact acknowledged. Clara at 5 started school in the autumn of 1889, and on the first day she walked into the schoolhouse and evaluated the room with the thoroughness of a commander assessing terrain, and then sat down and opened her reader with the composure of someone who had been preparing for this and found the reality satisfactory. Adelaide watched from outside the window, which she knew was excessive but did anyway, and saw Clara in that classroom and felt the long line of it, from her mother's store to the school board argument to this child with Frank's eyes, sitting in a school where arithmetic would be taught to her because Adelaide had made sure of it. The winter of 1889 was the mildest in years, and the creek held its level through February, and the cistern Frank had put in after the 1883 drought was full to the lip, and the root cellar was well stocked, and the farmhouse held its warmth against the wind, the way stone farmhouses did, impassively and completely. Adelaide and Frank sat on the covered porch on a winter evening when the temperature was cold enough for breath to show, but not so cold as to drive them inside, wrapped in wool blankets, with the dark winter sky above the cottonwoods as full of stars as it had been on the night they rode back from their first Friday dinner in town, and they sat in the quiet that had become over 11 years the most comfortable thing in her life. "Are you happy?" Frank asked. He asked this periodically, not as a check of performance but as a genuine question, the way a person asked it when they actually wanted to know. "Yes," Adelaide said. "Are you?" "More than I knew to want," he said, which was his version of poetic, and she had come to understand it as such. She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked at the stars. The Texas sky in winter was a different creature than the Texas sky in summer, colder and clearer and somehow more candid, as though the heat had burned away something and left only the essential. "I used to be afraid," she said, "that this was the kind of thing that went wrong, that it couldn't actually be what it seemed." "What changed your mind?" he asked, though he knew. "You," she said, "being consistent, that's the thing that changed my mind, not one big gesture. Just being there every day, doing what you said you would do." He pressed his lips to the top of her head briefly, the way he had done since they were married, a small and private punctuation mark. "I intend to keep being there," he said. "I know you do," she said. "That's the thing." They sat on the porch until the cold drove them inside, and the farmhouse took them in, and the fire was low and warm, and their 3 children were sleeping in their rooms. Thomas with his reader still open on the blanket beside him because he read until he fell asleep every night, and no intervention had changed this. James curled with complete abandon the way only deeply satisfied children slept. Clara on her back with her arms straight at her sides, and her expression composed even in sleep, as though she was simply resting between projects. Frank checked each of them, as he did every night, a circuit of the house that he had made since Thomas was an infant and had never stopped making. And Adelaide watched him in the doorway of each room and thought about a man who said "follow me" on a platform in July with no particular reason to say it beyond the simple fact that someone needed a direction and he had one to offer. She had followed him. And he had followed her in every way that mattered, had followed her through the building of a farm and the raising of children and the slow, steady work of a life made from nothing more than land and willingness, and the decision to show up every day and mean it. In the spring of 1890, they planted 2 new apple trees in the orchard to replace the ones lost in the drought of 1883, and Thomas helped dig the holes and James handled the new root balls with the care he gave to all growing things, and Clara stood at the edge of the orchard with her hands on her hips and directed the placement with authority. And Frank and Adelaide stood back and watched their children work in the earth of the land that had started with 20 acres and a solicitor's letter and a single decision on a July afternoon. The trees went into the ground in the April sun, and Frank put a shovel into the earth alongside Thomas, and Thomas looked up at him the way he still sometimes looked at him, with the particular quality of a child who was choosing something, the way he had chosen Frank across a kitchen table at 8 months old with both hands and complete certainty. "Good deep," Frank told him, "so the roots have room to go." "I know," Thomas said and dug. Adelaide looked at the 2 of them and then at James and Clara along the fence row, and then at the farmhouse with its stone walls and glass windows and the porch looking south over the cottonwoods, and she looked at all of it the way she had looked at the platform in July of 1878, with full knowledge of the distance traveled. The roots had had room to go. Everything was standing. Everything was and would be, and had been earned by every step of the way and every choice made with the head and then, finally and correctly, with the heart. And there was not a single thread of it left loose, not a single thing unresolved or uncertain, only the deep and settled fact of a life fully built. She went to where Frank was standing, shoulder to shoulder with her oldest son in the spring earth, and she put her hand on his back between his shoulder blades, and he turned and smiled at her. And the smile was the same one, and it was still enough to move something in her, after all these years and all these seasons. The smile that had first appeared over a ledger and a baby's first sound and had never, not once, been anything other than exactly what it was. The farm grew and held. The children grew and held. The orchard produced every summer. The horses Frank trained moved across the region and carried his name with them. The dry goods contracts renewed each year. Thomas learned the books and then the land. James learned the horses and then some of the books. Clara, who was going to run everything someday, learned all of it with the methodical thoroughness of someone who intended to be prepared. And Adelaide Dalton Hadley, who had arrived in Cutter's Creek, Texas, on a July afternoon in 1878 with a carpetbag and a 3-month-old baby and 20 acres she had never seen, stood in the middle of all of it and knew it for exactly what it was. Everything she had come for, everything she had built, and one man who had said follow me on a platform and had never once, in all the years since, given her a single reason to regret that she had.